my name's Liam Byrne. I've been a Member of Parliament for 20 years now in the House of Commons, and I'm not going to talk for very long today. Westminster is full of politicians who talk too much. I have friends who I've not spoken to for days because I simply didn't want to interrupt them. But what I'm going to try and do this afternoon is tell you why I think inequality is now potentially a weapon of mass destruction and what it is that we need to do about it. And of course, our story starts with this guy. Everyone knows this guy, right? Who is this? Adam Smith, thank you very much. Worked 3 hours away up the A1 and wrote an extraordinary book 250 years ago called The Wealth of Nations. And ever since Adam Smith's great book, we have been quite interested in this country about the wealth of the nation. But here's the funny thing. If you and I went outside into the street outside and we asked people what was the wealth of our nation today, unless we went to the economics department at Durham University, in which case we get 3 different answers, but if we went outside and asked people what the wealth of this nation was today, people wouldn't know. So here's the answer. Since I was born in the holy town of Warrington back in 1970, the wealth of our nation has multiplied by 100-fold. That is up to just over 12 trillion pounds. Now, 12 trillion pounds, and you'll notice, by the way, it's doubled since the financial crash and through the period of austerity and all sorts of other bumps along the road. Despite those bumps, wealth has multiplied 100-fold. So that's a really hard number to get your head around. So let me just sort of help you sort of visualize it. So this is some of the gold that Gordon didn't sell back in the day. But you could basically, 12 trillion pounds is enough for you to pave a path of gold bars sort of 4 bars wide between John O'Groats and Land End. That's how much 12 trillion pounds is. So it's quite a lot of money. But here's the inconvenient truth. For most of my life, the way that we shared that wealth was getting more equal. By and large, as the country created wealth, the way that we shared that wealth was getting more equal. But look what happened in 2010. In 2010, things began to change. In fact, they began to change so fast that the top 1%, the luckiest people in our country, have multiplied their wealth by, on average, about 2 million quid each. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't feel £2 million richer, despite the flood of freebies that is washing through the House of Commons. But the top 1% have multiplied their wealth by 31 times more than everybody else. That's how significant wealth inequality has now become. Now, I grew up in a family that cared about these things. This is my mum and dad. They met at Durham University in the 1960s at University College. I've just been to have a weepy moment to go and look at the college where they met. And they threw themselves into public life. That's why I'm here and not in a Premier League footballer, which you can see I was all set to become when I was a young boy. But look, the truth is that it's not just families like mine that care about this. We are all deeply anxious about what is going on. And how do we know this? Well, just look at the telly. Look at this extraordinary blizzard of what some call wealth porn. Look at the kind of programs that we now get, Succession and Downton Abbey and Parasite and The Gilded Age and Crazy Rich Asians, and my personal favourite, which is Above Deck, Below Deck, which I've had to watch extensively to write my book. And what do they do? What are these things? It's like a mass anxiety dream because our culture is telling us something, and it's telling us that we should be worried. It's lighting up what some call the absurdity of affluence. We now live in a country where we have record sales of private jets, record sales of super yachts, record sales of luxury cars, and yet in constituencies like mine, in East Birmingham, the most income-deprived constituency in the country, we have food banks that are literally running out of food. In every food bank in this country, we now have queues outside that are at record levels, and we rely on the tender mercies of the British people to get through this. We now employ in my office somebody full-time to help with food bank collections. And when we take our food bank crates out, when we go into schools and mosques and churches and community halls to ask people to give, it is always the poorest who give most. We went to one school, Adderley School, to pick up 1/4 ton of food. And we talked to the kids there about what it was that motivated them. These children were literally taking penguin bars out of their lunch boxes to put in a food bank collection crate. Because they said, when we heard that others had nothing, that made us feel sad. And we wanted them to have what we have. Yet, can we be happy with this moral emergency in our country today when you have record sales of private jets and luxury cars and super yachts, and we have kids giving penguin bars into food bank collection crates? And even if that doesn't move you, this is why you should be worried. Because unequal countries have three things in common. They're poor because, generally speaking, very rich people find ways to avoid paying their taxes. In fact, if people in the top income bracket today paid everything that they owed, if they paid the average rate of marginal tax, we would have £22 billion extra coming into the exchequer. So that's not just a UK thing, that's a global thing. And of course, what that means is that a country gets poorer if you get inequality that gets greater. You get corruption beginning to settle in, because of course, wealth seeks power like wasps seek jam. And having been an MP for 20 years now, I now see big money stalking the corridors of power more than I have ever seen before in the last 20 years. And it's not just about suits and glasses and donations to political parties. It's much more insidious than that. It's about people giving money to think tanks. It's about people giving money to certain TV stations. It's about those TV stations giving certain money to politicians. It's about those organizations then backing particular candidates to lead a political party. So the way in which money cascades and washes around the corridors of power now is much more insidious than perhaps people realize. And of course, what unequal countries become is stagnant. Because what happens in unequal countries is that social mobility collapses because those with privilege like to cascade that privilege down and down and down and down through the generations. You might also add a fourth word to this list, which is hot, because the carbon footprint of those in the top 1% is about 2/3 the equivalent of global carbon emissions, which, by the way, hit an all-time high a couple of years ago. Now, think about it. Put these things together. Put together countries that are becoming poor, countries that are becoming corrupt, countries that are becoming stagnant, countries that are becoming hot. And what do you get? You get what we call, in my trade, voters who are pretty pissed off. And of course, what do? They vote for populists. And having now analysed the constituency results of every seat up at the general election and every region up at the general election, what we've just seen happen in our country basically confirms that thesis. So those constituencies where wealth growth did not keep pace were the constituencies, and indeed the regions, that were much more likely to vote for reform. And this is dangerous, because of course populists are not even nationalists, they're tribalists. They come to power by triggering a war of all against all. And so that is where we now run the risk of mass destruction, because you're now beginning to see countries fail, because their institutions fail, because frankly, amidst the anger and division, you're getting the wrong people elected to power. Now, the good news is that this is not a prognosis of gloom and doom. This is actually a prognosis of hope, because there are answers that good people, by coming together, can actually put into effect. Now, you'll have all heard of universal basic income. Well, this is better. Universal basic capital. It's a simple idea. It's based on some economic theory by a brilliant economist called James Mead, Nobel Prize winner, writing in the 1960s, disciple of John Maynard Keynes, invented national income accounting about 30 or 40 years ago. And based on those ideas, you can see that actually it would be pretty possible for us to build a system of universal basic capital here in this country. Three big components. Universal savings accounts for everybody. Not a hard thing to do. We've been piloting it in this country for the last 4 or 5 years. Opening a bank account for everybody when they start work is something that would be perfectly possible and important, because a quarter of people in our country have net savings of less than £100. Step 2, pay into these accounts a one-off dividend of £10,000 for every young person at the age of 25. Why? Because £10,000 is the average shortfall on a deposit to buy a house. But look, young people could use this for all sorts of things. It could be to kickstart their education. It could be to kickstart their pension. It could be to invest in getting a home of their own. And where would that money come from? It would come from doing what 80 countries around the world have done, which is build a bigger national wealth fund. If we had not given away the proceeds of North Sea oil all those years ago, we would have a wealth fund in this country that would be worth £500 billion. But we didn't do that, and so we haven't got one of those. So let's learn from the error of history and create a much bigger national wealth fund for our country today so that we can pay those dividends to the next generation. Actually, you could put together a few state assets that we already have and add, over 5 years, one thing more: the proceeds from returning fairness to our tax system. Now, I obviously want you all to read this brilliant new book, which is just out in paperback. But if you don't read the book, there's one page that I would like you to read instead. Has anybody here read Rishi Sunak's tax return? One. Well, look, okay, for the rest of you, here it is. Rishi Sunak's tax return. Doesn't take long to read. It's only a page. And what the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice is that it declares an income of £2 million, but an effective rate of tax of 23%. Now, I ask you, can it be right when 1 in 5 taxpayers are paying above 40% that one of the richest men in the country should be paying a tax rate of 23%? Of course not. Of course that can't be right. What we need to do is to restore fairness to our tax system and have a tax code that reflects our moral code, which tells us that those with the broadest shoulders should pay a little bit more. And those are some of the taxes that weren't implemented last week, but which could be implemented in the future. And if we get that right, the prize could be extraordinary. It could be this incredible generation, Gen Z, actually equipped with the capital that they need in order to thrive for the future. My final point, I suppose, is just to step back and think about what is at stake. You know, we've been through a brutal time in this country over the last 15 years. We're not alone. Lots of countries have gone through similar experiences. And there's been lots of talk in Westminster about, you know, whether we've been a bit too downbeat and a bit too gloomy and a bit too depression-inducing. And I think those criticisms are fair, because the next century could be extraordinary. 90% of the scientists who have ever worked are alive and at work today. The revolutions that they will author in artificial intelligence, in genetic medicine, in global gigabit connectivity, in the shift to green energy, could trigger an increase in living standards of somewhere between 9-fold and 13-fold over the centuries to come. That could expand the freedom that each and every one of us has in ways that we cannot imagine. It could ensure that we have options, agency, opportunities, choices that our parents and grandparents never could have dreamed of. This future could be absolutely extraordinary. But we have to remember one thing. It's a lesson that Franklin Roosevelt taught us. That there is no freedom. There's no freedom worth its name without security. And there's no security without wealth. So why don't we be the generation that gathers ourselves together and restores an old ideal? An ideal that goes back to Plato, that has once informed thinkers and philosophers and writers on both left and right. We should be the generation that builds not just a wealthy democracy, but a democracy of wealth. That, I think, is an idea worth voting for. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
You can have. That's a present for you.
Thank you. Very much. Just rebalancing the wealth inequality right here on stage. Right. I mean, this topic for me it's fascinating. What I find so consistently shocking about it is how little it gets talked about, perhaps where it matters. I previewed coming into this talk. It's basically non-existent in presidential politics. I guess Bernie Sanders tried a little bit in the past, and then Obama and others seem to just shut him down consistently. I would argue. So why? Yeah, I mean, why isn't it being discussed? Well, you know, why aren't they stealing from you at this very moment? Say, oh my God, this guy's brilliant. We can totally win elections on this stuff. We still got a couple of days to make a difference here. What's happening?
So I think the funny thing is that we're talking about it as a country, but not necessarily in politics. So when you go through what you see on in streaming land, if you look at the dystopian novel today. Once upon a time, dystopian novels were about, if you read Dickens or Trollope or Dostoevsky, the villains are kind of jaded and lax and cynical. They're not seeking aspirational impunity. They're not trying to put themselves above the law. And yet that's exactly what's happening in the kind of thing that is on Netflix today.
Yeah.
So why is that happening? Because we're all worried about it. It is a mass anxiety dream that we're having. So I actually think that, as ever, and this is one thing I've learned in politics, the public is ahead of the politicians. The public does care about this, and the politicians need to catch up. And you've got to be a bit careful about leaning into the politics of envy, but frankly, we shouldn't be afraid of that. You just need to get on the streets and talk to the people.
Yeah,
They'll tell you the way to talk about it.
No, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I'm sure with many leaders, they'll wait for it to become for the Overton window to shift into the safe zone,
exactly.
and then suddenly they'll start talking about that sort of thing. But even in public, I mean, you mentioned a lot of things where there's a hint of that sort of thing, but it's not really overtly.
No.
Do you know what I mean? And I find that just very odd that just regular people aren't saying it's BS about what's happening in the country. I still don't think a lot of people know even the stats that
the stats are shocking. People get pretty horrified when you show them stats.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm sure they do.
But what people obviously see is the conspicuous consumption from that. And I suppose the message I've got is, sure, you should be worried about that, but what should worry you more is the inconspicuous consumption of power. Yeah. Because actually the role of money in politics today is more insidious and corrupting than I've ever seen before. Really?
Wow. Okay. Well, that would obviously be certainly a factor as to perhaps why they're not speaking out as loud. So, just on the last point, another billionaire, Mark Cuban, was talking about why he had been, I think, previously pro-Trump and is now pro-Kamala. But he was talking about the issue is that. In entrepreneurship, you sell the sizzle, not the steak. Yeah. And he says Trump, as much as I despise the man, is pretty good at selling. He's got no steak to offer, so all he's got is sizzle, and he's selling it well. Yeah. And Biden is all steak. He's telling you about the cow. He's telling you about where the farmer, but he doesn't tell you any sizzle. But that I mean, I know you probably can't comment on this publicly, but that's not a Biden-only disease. Correct. And there are a lot of folks that I would argue on the good side of the fence that seem to only want to focus on the steak. And what's happening there? Why? So
this is so interesting because I think actually what is being missed in a debate about the past and the present is an argument about the future. And actually what we've got to do is say, look, the future could be extraordinary. Think about the way in which all of our freedoms could expand in the years to come. But should we try and make a democracy of those freedoms? Should we try and make those freedoms for everybody? Yeah. And so I just think, in a way, politics has become quite uninspiring at the moment because a lot of the hope is being drained out, and a lot of the sense of this is where we could be going has been lost. And I think, if anything, it's a plea. The book is a plea to return to that.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, you'll be sticking around to sign it afterwards. So, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.